quilt peeps. This is Tish from Cotton Candy Quilts in lovely scenic Gaston, Indiana, and today we're going to talk about quilt binding. A beautiful hand-turned quilt binding is the perfect finishing touch to your quilt. If you already are happy with your quilt binding, that's fine. There is no need to change anything. There's no quilt police. If you're happy with what you're doing, then great. But if you need a few tips to get you through, or you're a beginner and you're daunted by the idea of doing a hand finished binding, then let's talk, because we can make this better for you. So if you're ready, I'm ready. Let's get started. So the first thing that we want to do is figure out how much fabric we need and how many strips we need. I know this is really hard to see on the screen, but this is a binding calculator, and this is available for free on the website www.cottoncandyquiltshop.com, and I'll put the address in the comments below. So this helps. There is nothing worse. I can tell you there is nothing worse than getting to the end of your binding and finding out you're 5 inches short, and this will prevent that. So the first thing you need is the length of your quilt, and mine is 48 inches. And if you take that times 2, it's 96. And the width of my quilt is 42 inches. And if you take that times 2, it's 84. And if you add those together, it's 180 inches. And then I'm adding 12, which is 100, that equals 192 inches right here. And if you divide 192 by 40, you end up with 4.8. So it's going to take 4.8 strips to get enough strips to go around my quilt. Well, I don't want to do this by parts of a strip. You can't have parts of a strip, so that actually equals 5. And then to find out how much actual yardage you need, you're going to take 5 strips and take it times the width of your binding. I actually do mine at 2 1/4 instead of 2 1/2. And the reason why is because it makes a nice tight fold over your quilt without any of that gap. So if I take 5 times 2 1/4, it equals 11 1/4 inches of fabric. And if I divide 11 1/4 inches of fabric by 36, it equals 0.31, which is about 1/3 of a yard. So I need to have 1/3 of a yard to go all the way around this quilt. So now that we know how many strips we need, let's get those cut, and I'll meet you right back at the sewing machine. Okay, so when you're putting your binding strips together, you really don't want to sew them together with a straight seam, because when you put it on your quilt, you're going to have a great big lump right there. And apologies in advance, because my pup is with me today, and he's rather noisy, and he may make more noise, so apologies in advance. He's really cute though. He is really cute. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay the first strip out, and you notice that I'm laying it out right sides up. On a solid, it's difficult to tell which side is a right side up, but in a quilt store I can tell you that all fabric is wound with the right side out. So that would be the right side of your fabric. I'm going to take the next strip. Let me move these out of the way. I'm going to take the next strip and lay it so that it's exactly perpendicular to the first one. And I am going over far enough that I am missing my selvage, because you don't want any selvage in your quilt anywhere. And then I'm just tilting it, and I am going to go right from this corner to this corner, right from here to here. Now, if you can sew fairly straight, you don't need to mark it or anything, but if you feel uncomfortable doing that, just take a chalk marker or a friction pin, because you're sewing right on it. It's not going to be in your quilt, and just mark that. So what I'm doing is just lining up the throat of my foot, one side to the other, and sewing. And then I'm not going to take anything out of the machine. I am taking that strip, I am turning it right side up, so you notice that it's curled under there, and then I'm adding the next strip. So for this quilt I need 5 strips. It's not a horrifically big quilt, but it's really cute. And thanks to my trip to Arizona this year, when I got the fabric for this quilt and the pattern, it is commemorative to my Arizona trip. It's going to look great on my guest bedroom wall. You notice I just keep flipping that over and putting the right side up. And I'm going to put all 5 strips together. Notice how far that I'm hanging that over so that I don't get any of the selvage in my binding strip. Now this is a straight binding, so the bindings are cut selvage to selvage off of the bolt, off of your fabric. I use straight bindings for straight quilts and bias bindings if there's a curve. This has 4 straight corners, so it doesn't need a bias binding, and with Quilt Shop quality fabric, the fabric is good enough that it doesn't really matter if you have a bias binding. Yes, there's a few more threads on the corner, but on the edge, but it's not that big of a deal with today's fabrics. And this is way easier because it doesn't stretch. So once I get to the end, you will notice that they're all joined together. So I'm going to clip those threads in between the binding strips. And then I'm going to cut off the ends so that it's about 1/4 inch. And I don't like take it over and use the rotary cutter. I just use some scissors and cut it about 1/4 inch. At that point, I'm going to take it over to my iron. I'm going to iron those to the sides, and I'm going to iron the entire binding end to end in half. So let me get that done, and I'll be right back. Alrighty, here we go. I have my binding made and folded in half with the raw edges to the right. And where there's a corner, let's see if we can find one here. The seam goes slantways because we did it on the bias, and that means there's not such a big lump in one place. This will be spread out over this many inches. It's about 2, and that will help it not having a great big lump there. If these little corners bother you, these little dog ears, you can cut those off. I tend not to, but you can. And I am starting somewhere in the middle of one side, and I am leaving a good 12 inches just hanging loose there. If you notice, I have on my 1/4 inch foot, not my walking foot, and I'll show you why here in a minute. The other thing that I need to tell you is that I am at a full 1/4 inch. I am not at a scant 1/4 inch. This is important if you want the edge of your binding to not have an empty spot in it where there's no quilt. So take your machine off scant and put it on full quarter. And then make sure and needle down. And you want to needle down because the weight of the quilt is going to pull as you start sewing around, and this will keep it from skipping stitches by pulling the fabric over while you're stitching. So I'm needle down, and I don't back stitch or lock stitch to begin, and I'll show you why when we get to the end. And I'm lining up the edge of the binding with the edge of the quilt, and I'm just going to sew down to the next corner. This is a small quilt. If I had a big quilt, where the camera is, my ironing board would be, and it would be the same height as my table, my sewing table, and that way it would hold the weight of the quilt while I'm sewing so it's not pulling down so hard. So I'm almost at the end here. So as I get closer to the end, I am going to stop a 1/4 inch off the edge of the quilt, and here in a second I'm going to put up a photo that shows the marks on your foot. So there's a mark right here at the front, right here. That's a 1/4 inch forward of your needle. So I'm going to stop this just as this gets a 1/4 inch forward of the needle. And then I'm going to needle up, and I'm going to pull this out from, kind of wrapped up there, pull this out from the machine, but I'm not going to cut the threads. There's really no reason to cut the threads. Then I'm going to pull this straight up. Let me get my fingers out of the way here. So when I pull this straight up, you can see that the binding looks like it's a continuation of the quilt. Do you see that? Do you see how nice and straight that is? The edge of the binding is even with the edge of the quilt. That's because we're a 1/4 inch in. And right here is your pretty little miter that's going to be on the front. So I'm going to put my fingers there. I hope you can see over here, but I will move them. And then fold down to make the next edge even with the quilt. And as you can see, if I can get my fingers out of the way, this is even with the edge of the quilt, and this is even with the edge of the quilt. And it makes a nice little miter right here. So I'm going to swing this around and put it back under my machine, and I am not going right to the edge, but rather there's a mark here at the back, right here at the back of your sewing foot, which again I'm going to show you on the close-up, and I'm going to put that right with the edge of the quilt. Oops, I'm sorry. There we go. And that should put my needle right at a 1/4 inch in. Needle down, do a lock stitch, turn it around, turn the quilt around, and then start going off on your next direction. And you're going to continue that on all 4 corners, just exactly the same way. So I'm going to finish taking this binding around, and I'll be right back. All right, as you can see, I have gone all the way around the quilt, but I have left just about 12 inches there, 12, 13, 14 inches, I don't measure, of a space to join the ends. There is less than a strip left, so I had the right number of strips. I'd rather have a little bit too much than a little not enough, because that is just no fun when your binding ends here and you have the strip left to add. And now I'm going to show you how to join the ends together without any math. This is like quilt magic. Once you get the method down of putting your binding on, there is a video that shows you only how to put the ends together in the Quilt Magic Minute, so you don't have to listen to this whole thing again. So the first thing I need to do is make a measuring device. And instead of using math, and instead of using a ruler, I am going to use the binding itself as a measuring device. This means that if you have a 3-inch binding, it still works. If you have a 2-inch binding, it still works. If you have a 4-inch binding, it still works. If you have a 2.5-inch binding, it still works, because you're always using itself to measure. So I'm going to take a chunk off of the end here, and I think I'm going to take it off of this end. So all I did was take a piece of batting or binding and cut it off from the end, and then I'm going to open it up. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the beginning end, lay it over the measuring device, and cut on the far side. That looks pretty good. And then I'm going to take this, the end, and pull it the other direction, and I'm going to cut off at the other end just a scissors width shorter. You can do it right at the edge, but I feel like sometimes I just don't, it's just too much fabric and it doesn't fit in very well. So it's maybe a 1/16 of an inch shorter than the actual piece, but not too much. And now these ends are going to go together perfectly. This is really cool. So I'm going to take this out because I don't need it anymore, and I'm going to turn my quilt around. Hopefully I won't bump the camera, but it can happen. And then on the right side, and this is really important that you do it in this particular order, I'm going to open up the binding and I'm going to roll it toward me to bring the right side up. The right side is where the bump is, where you've pressed it. Okay, so let's do that again. On the right side of your quilt, I'm going to roll it up, and then I'm going to bring the left side straight down, open it up, bring it straight down so that those bumps are next to each other but go in the opposite way. Do you see that we're making that very same miter that we made when we put the binding together to begin with? Then I'm going to put the weight of the quilt up here, and I'm going to fiddle a little bit. So I'm going to pull this up so that it's not pulling on the binding. I'm going to line up all of the edges. Make sure that binding is flat. I think this is one of the coolest things I learned when I was very first starting to quilt years and years ago, and I still use it today, and I just love it because my bindings turn out just the right size without a little fold and a tuck. So I can see where the point is right here, and I'm starting at the point up there, and then I'm just sewing that diagonal line, lining up with where I'm going. And if I've done this right, which it appears as if I have, then when I pull this flat, that binding is just going to fit in there. Isn't that the coolest thing? I just think that's the coolest thing. Once I've checked to make sure that there's no twist, because if you do this in the wrong order, then you end up with something that kind of looks like DNA. Once I've figured out that it's not and that it fits perfectly, I cut this to 1/4 of an inch. That black thread on black fabric is very hard to see, so I'm going to get it right next to my nose. Get rid of that. Then I finger press that seam one side to the other. It doesn't matter which way you're going. Pull that binding flat in between there, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to where I was and stitch over about 1 inch, because I didn't do any lock stitches or back stitches when I started or I ended. But if I sew over the same place, then it's going to lock those stitches. And this time I'm just going to back stitch just a little bit to just make sure those stitches stay put. I'm going to continue to sew until I get to my starting point, and I'm going to sew over about 1 inch. Lock those stitches or back stitch again, it doesn't matter which. And there you have a perfectly attached binding. Isn't that pretty? And the corners, if you notice, here's where a corner is. It's kind of hard to see because it's black on black. But this little flap isn't attached to either side. It's completely loose. So when I fold this over to the back to hand stitch it, it's going to make a perfect little miter. And I'm going to get the light in a better position, and then I'm going to show you how I hand stitch this down for a perfect miter. And this is something that I do when I'm watching TV, so turn on Dancing with the Stars and join me for hand stitching. Okay, so as you can see, I am using really obnoxious white thread so that you can see it. And I have threaded the needle, and I am going to show you that this is a milliner's needle. It is very, very long. Quilting betweens, quilting needles, are made for quilting, and you don't actually hold on to the needle. You actually take and tip it with your finger. So they're too short to hold on to, and they just make your fingers hurt. So get you some really good milliner's needles. We have John James milliner's needles on the website, and they're not very expensive, and they're really sharp, and you're going to love them. So that you can see, I'm doing this with white thread. And I have already made a knot in the thread, and I have anchored it into the seam allowance that goes underneath the binding. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in 2 to 3 threads on the binding, and I go straight down, and then I come up about 1/4 of an inch away. So it's down through the binding and up through the quilt. Down through the binding and up through the quilt. A lot of people turn this backwards and go down through the quilt and up through the binding, and I think it's harder to get an invisible stitch that way. So as you can see, the quilt is on my lap, and I've just turned the edge back. And even with white thread, this is going to mostly disappear into the quilt. So down through the binding and up through the quilt, about 1/4 of an inch away. And do this real fast here so that we can get to the end, and I'm going to show you how to do a perfect little mitered corner. If you notice, I'm using wonder clips to hold down the binding. And if you look at my left thumb, you will see that it has a chunky amount of arthritis in it. And that is actually from holding down on bindings. So the wonder clips really help with that. So I highly recommend them. I love them. I use them for purse making. I use them for about everything. Let me stitch real quick here. When you're choosing thread for your binding, you want to match the color of the thread to the binding, not the quilt itself. In this case, it would both be black. But if the binding was black and the front was blue, like some of the front, the back was blue, then you would still want to use black thread. That's going to disappear easiest for you so that you can't see it. There's all kinds of, in the Quilt Magic Minutes, I show you how to thread a needle without being able to see the thread or the needle, because I just have a horrible time. I have some age on my eyes. Have some age on my eyes. Okay, I'm getting kind of close to the end here. And I want you to see that I've pulled that end down all the way off of the quilt. All the way off of the quilt. And as I get near the end, I am going to hand stitch all the way to the end of the quilt. And I'm not going to stop where it miters and just pull it back, because I want a pretty miter on both sides. So I am actually going all the way to the end. One more stitch should do it. Now I am completely off the quilt. See that? Completely off the quilt. Now I'm going to take the next side and I'm going to fold that corner back over the seam allowance, and your oh look, there's a little thread from the quilting. Your binding should always just cover your stitching from where you sewed it on. But look at that pretty little miter. Isn't that gorgeous? Isn't that gorgeous? And then I take a stitch or two right in the corner. And then I take off in the other direction, pulling it tight. And you will see that you have a beautiful miter on both sides of your quilt. Isn't that pretty? I'm going to try to do a close-up for you here so that you can really see what I'm doing. So I'm going down through about 2 or 3 threads, and then I take the needle through the quilt sandwich and up about 1/4 of an inch away. Hopefully you can see that well. Right here I'm going through the binding, and up here I am not going through the binding. See, I can lift it straight up. And that makes a perfect stitch. If you notice, that's just burying into there even though I'm using white thread. Let's do it again. So down through the binding just by a couple of threads, through the quilt sandwich and up about 1/4 of an inch away with the binding loose. So you're coming up in the quilt only. And then pull it tight and it just disappears even though it's white thread.